As we journey through the annals of history, we often encounter tales of unsettling events, creepy, sickening, and outright cruel incidents that have transpired. While many find their way into the pages of history books and into the curriculum of our classrooms, there exists a trove of untold stories, concealed in the shadows of the past. Today, we embark on a quest to unearth some of the most disturbing and chilling events that history has concealed from our awareness. Join me as we delve into 17 unsung chapters of our shared past, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's jump in. Vampire killings. Let's kick things off with a peculiar story from the 1800s, where folks believed in vampires. Now, before we get too excited, spoiler alert, these weren't actual vampires. At least I'm pretty sure they weren't. Back in the 1800s in New England, people thought that dead bodies were coming out of their graves at night, terrorizing the living. To tackle this spooky problem, they started digging up the bodies. Now, some folks took a straightforward approach and just flipped the dead person face down. Others, though, went a bit extreme. Picture this: tearing apart the bones and putting them back together in a different order, or burning the deceased person's heart. And get this, inhaling the smoke. Believe it or not, they thought inhaling that smoke could cure tuberculosis. I know, sounds wild, right? Certain towns were so into this whole ritual that they turned it into a bit of a festival. Imagine celebrating the digging up of bodies and their subsequent destruction. It's a bit unsettling, to say the least. But here's the twist. The people genuinely believed these corpses were vampires causing trouble at night. So I guess it brought them some peace of mind, even though it does sound pretty bizarre to us today. Dentures. Let's talk about dentures. Nowadays they're made from materials like composite resin or porcelain, but back in the 18th and 19th centuries, things were quite different. No fancy materials like we have today. People were still losing teeth a lot, thanks to sugary diets, attempts at teeth whitening that damaged enamel, and a general lack of knowledge about hygiene. So, what did they use for dentures? Well, for many, the easiest and cheapest option was to get teeth from dead bodies. Yeah, I know, kind of creepy. If you had some money, you might upgrade to dentures made from ivory. Others resorted to using animal teeth or even wood. Not exactly the most sanitary choices, right? What makes it even more cringeworthy is that back then, even professional doctors weren't big on sterilizing their tools. Some didn't even bother with disinfecting before surgery. Imagine that, getting dentures made from who knows what, with tools that weren't exactly squeaky clean. It's a good thing we've come a long way in dental care since then. Mummy unwrapping party. Let's talk about something quite strange. Mummy unwrapping parties. We already know people did weird stuff with mummies in the past, like eating them or using their remains for medicine. But here's a new trend that kicked off after Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798. So, Europeans got really into mummies in the 19th century. Travelers started bringing back whole mummies they bought off the streets in Egypt. Now, instead of thinking mummies had some kind of medicinal power, people saw them as party material. Yes, you heard it right. Party material. They started this weird thing called mummy unwrapping parties. Imagine this: wealthy Victorians gathering around while the host slowly unwrapped a dead body. It was like showing off how rich they were, and at the same time giving their guests a mix of horror and delight. I have no idea what they did with the mummies after the public unwrapping, but I bet it wasn't anything pleasant. Bomb shadows. We've all heard about the tragic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which took the lives of 226,000 people. But there's something you might not have learned about: the aftermath. As the bombs hit, the light and heat were absorbed by people and objects in their path. This absorbed energy then bleached the ground where nothing had been, leaving eerie marks in the shape of people and objects on the pavement. These haunting marks became known as the shadows of the dead. Even after almost 80 years, some of these shadows are still visible on pavements and walls all over the city. They serve as a powerful reminder of the destructive force of humanity. The shadows silently tell the story of that devastating day and linger as a somber testament to the capacity for destruction that exists within us. Stained glass. If you step into an old church, you'll likely see beautiful stained glass on the walls. But what might surprise you is that, in some of the really old pieces, there's a peculiar ingredient that adds an interesting twist. In 1112, a German monk spilled the beans on the process. It all starts innocently enough. They mix sand and potash at high temperatures until it turns into molten glass. Then comes a stabilizer, followed by coloring the glass with metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. Now here's where it gets a bit unusual. After cooling and shaping the glass, they add small details with paint. This paint, made from lead or copper, gets suspended in urine. Yes, you heard it right. Some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint. It's a bit funny to think about, but definitely a weird ingredient to find in paint. Vlad the Impaler. Let's dive into the story of Vlad III, born in 1431 into a royal family. His father, Vlad Dracul, ruled Wallachia, a place facing battles and bloodshed during the 15th century. The Ottoman Empire sought to push west towards Europe, while Christian crusaders moved eastward to the Holy Land. In 1442, things took a dark turn. Vlad Dracul was called to a meeting with the Ottomans, but it was a trap. He and his sons were arrested, with Vlad III and his brother held hostage. Vlad Dracul was allowed to leave, but only if he left his sons behind. He agreed, and for the next few years, Vlad and his brother endured torture while strangely tutoring their captors in science, philosophy, and art, turning some of them into warriors. After the deaths of his father and brother, Vlad was released. He became the leader of Wallachia, defending his land when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. This is when he earned the infamous nickname Vlad the Impaler. He often used metal or wooden poles to impale invaders through their chests, or sometimes vertically up, piercing through shoulders, necks, or mouths. Despite his respect in some circles, Vlad became notorious for killing thousands of people. His brutal reputation eventually inspired Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Count Dracula. So, while he may have been a defender of his land, Vlad the Impaler's methods were undeniably ruthless and earned him a lasting place in history. Incubators. Let's step back to the early 20th century when the view on premature babies was quite different. Many doctors believed these tiny infants weren't meant to survive, so sadly, they were often left to fate. However, there was a man named Martin Cooney who thought differently. To change this grim narrative, Cooney had to make a bit of a show out of it. You see, people back then loved to gawk at unusual things and laugh at the different. Enter sideshows. Cooney decided to display premature babies in what he called hatcheries as part of a sideshow in Coney Island. For just a quarter, visitors could marvel at these small and peculiar young lives. In this unusual way, Cooney managed to save over 6,500 premature babies by turning their safety into a kind of spectacle. It might sound odd, but in those times it worked. Eventually, doctors started to see the merit in his ideas. Fast forward to today, and incubators are life-saving devices used in hospitals worldwide. Cooney's unconventional approach ended up making a significant impact on how we care for premature babies today. Pharaoh Pepi. Let's talk about Pharaoh Pepi II, who ruled Egypt around 2278 BC to 2216 BC. Now, the exact timeline is a bit fuzzy, but we do know he became pharaoh at the tender age of 6. Pepi II is remembered as one of Egypt's toughest rulers, and that's not surprising when you realize he was basically a first grader given the power of a pharaoh. Being in charge at such a young age seemed to affect his ego, and he made some pretty demanding requests. One of the weirdest things he did was to keep flies away from him. Apparently, Pepi II despised flies more than anything in the world. So what did he do? He'd make several slaves cover themselves head to toe in honey and stand naked near him. The idea was to attract the flies to the honey-covered slaves, keeping them away from the pharaoh. Sadly, by the end of the day, these slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores from the swarm of insects. Many of them would even succumb to diseases like malaria. Interestingly, later on, flies became a symbol of persistence and tenacity for the Egyptians. But during Pepi II's nearly 90-year reign, flies were considered the worst creatures alive, all because of the pharaoh's unusual attempt to keep them at bay. Leather-bound books. Imagine a time when the leather on books wasn't from cows, but from people, and these books had a chilling name: anthropodermic bibliophagy. Now, they made these books in a way similar to how they make them now, but with one big difference. They used human skin instead of animal skin. Though only 18 of these books are confirmed to still exist, who knows how many were made back then. Shockingly, these books were often crafted from the skin of executed convicts. There are even tales from the French Revolution about a tannery outside Paris rumored to be using human skin. It's pretty eerie to think about, and thankfully, we've moved on to different materials for binding our books today. Nowadays, finding real leather on anything is a bit unusual, and the idea of using human skin for books is definitely a thing of the past. Cat phone. In 1929, two scientists at Princeton University were curious about how the auditory nerve perceives sound. To test this, they needed a subject. Naturally, not many volunteers were stepping forward, so they decided to perform the experiment on a cat. Before you cringe too much, they heavily sedated the cat for the operation. During the procedure, the scientists cut out parts of the cat's brain and attached a telephone wire, one end to its auditory nerve and the other to a receiver. Surprisingly, the cat survived the operation. To their delight, when they spoke into the cat's ear, they could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to know if it would work when the cat was no longer alive. So unfortunately, they had to test their theory by ending the cat's life. Sadly, the cat phone no longer worked without a functional brain. Despite the rather grim story, these scientists did contribute to a better understanding of the brain. Their work helped future researchers in developing cochlear implants. So while the method might make us cringe, at least it wasn't all in vain, as it added to our knowledge of how the brain processes sound. Leningrad famine. For a harrowing 872 days, the people of Leningrad endured one of the most devastating military blockades in history. In less than 3 years, the population plummeted from 2.5 million to a mere 800,000. The ordeal began in September 1941, when Axis powers bombarded the city, cutting it off from the outside world. The people faced a grim reality: no wood, no gas, no coal, and worst of all, no food. Winter made an already dire situation unbearable. With temperatures plunging to -40 degrees, survival became a daily struggle. Many had to resort to burning their possessions just to eke out one more day of life. As time passed, the situation grew increasingly grim. People would leave their homes and never return. Initially, many assumed they succumbed to the cold, but soon a more sinister truth emerged. Mysterious disappearances were connected to the sudden availability of meat in the market, often labeled as horse or dog. Desperation reached unthinkable levels as some resorted to killing others just to feed themselves. Heartbreakingly, some were even driven to kill their own families for survival. Official records cite 2,000 cases of documented cannibalism, but many believe the true number is much higher. Amidst this tragedy, the stark contrast between the elite and the commoners became painfully evident. The privileged hoarded food that arrived in the city via the lakes, never experiencing hunger. Journal recordings from the time reveal grotesque scenes of the elite enjoying lavish feasts, such as goose and caviar, while the common people froze to death in the streets. The Leningrad famine stands as a haunting chapter in history, marked by unimaginable suffering and stark social inequality. Minnie Dean. Let's go back to New Zealand in 1880, where Minnie Dean, often known as Mulamina Dean, was a well-known nanny. Things took a dark turn for her when, in 1889, a child under her care suddenly passed away. Initially seen as a tragic accident, suspicions grew when, 2 years later, 2 minors met the same mysterious fate while under her watch. The police decided it was time to look into the matter. After some investigation, they discovered that Minnie had been trying to take out life insurance on the minors under her care. This raised some serious red flags. Authorities immediately intervened and took another young boy from her care, finding him in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into Minnie's crimes intensified. She was caught trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. A search of her house uncovered 3 more covered-up victims. Minnie Dean was eventually found guilty of all her crimes, making her the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Her once respected name as a caregiver took a dark turn, leaving a chilling mark on the history of the country. Radiation test subject. In 1999, there was a man named Hisashi Uchi, a power plant technician working at the Tokimura nuclear power plant. Unfortunately, he became known for a tragic incident that exposed him to the highest amount of radiation in human history. Due to a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and the pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his co-workers made a critical error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, resulting in a near-fatal burst of gamma rays. Uchi, being closest to the incident, suffered severe injuries and was rushed to the hospital. Upon examination, doctors discovered that he had no more white blood cells, meaning he had no immune system left. Despite his intense pain and deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive for 83 days under the family's request. During this time, he served as a test subject for experiment. Mumia. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, with a few cases popping up in the 18th century, a practice known as mummying gained widespread popularity in many European countries. Now, the name itself might give you chills, and rightfully so, because mummying involved using human remains as a form of medicine. Top physicians of that era believed in the medicinal power of mummies, thinking that ingesting certain remains could cure various ailments such as coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they weren't out there munching on carcasses directly. Instead, they either ground the bones into a powder and drank it, or consumed an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. At one point, mummying was so popular that it's believed to be a reason why there are so few well-preserved mummies these days. The high demand for human flesh during that time led to a significant depletion of mummies. It might sound bizarre to us now, but it was a widely practiced form of medicine in the past. Jameson, meet one of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, a man named Jameson who fancied himself an adventurer. In 1888, driven by his adventurous spirit, he set out to explore the Congo. Now, instead of documenting the beauty of his travels, Jameson wrote about and demanded some truly disturbing things from the locals. Before embarking on this expedition, Jameson learned that the area he was visiting had a population known for practicing cannibalism. Strangely, Jameson's dream was to witness this firsthand. A bit suspicious, wouldn't you say? Nonetheless, according to Asad Farhan, his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a group of slaves for just a few handkerchiefs. He then handed her over to the tribe. Now here's where it gets even more unsettling. Jameson didn't directly pay the tribe, but he found a roundabout way to essentially pay for this girl. To make matters worse, he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event as it unfolded. It's just wrong on so many levels, adding a dark chapter to his adventurous exploits. Cambodian Barbies. Let's delve into a piece of history that might ring a bell. The Khmer Rouge, an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held power from 1975 to 1979. Unfortunately, their legacy is stained by some of the most horrifying acts of genocide, with nearly 2 million lives lost under their rule. During their radical governance, the Khmer Rouge isolated the entire country from foreign influences. This meant shutting down schools, hospitals, factories, banks, and even foreign agriculture. The intention was to stimulate a rebirth of the country, but the reality was quite the opposite. Cambodia spiraled into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people faced dire circumstances. Despite widespread starvation, individuals were forbidden from foraging for food. Disobeying orders meant facing death. As desperation grew, some turned to folk magic, transforming Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since the dissolution of the Khmer Rouge in 1999, The leaders have been held accountable for their atrocities, and the people are free from the grip of this genocidal regime. It's a somber chapter in history, but one that serves as a reminder of the resilience of those who survived and the importance of justice. Rabbit Woman. Now, in our top spot, let's talk about Mary Toft, also known as the Rabbit Woman. Back in 1726, her name echoed through Surrey, England, as the woman who supposedly gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's not possible, and you'd be absolutely right. But the tale of how she convinced people it was real is quite a wild one. It turns out Mary Toft was indeed pregnant at one point, but unfortunately miscarried. This event might have triggered something in her, sending her into a kind of madness. Mary started proclaiming that she was giving birth to various animal parts. Her local doctor got involved in the case, and surprisingly, everyone initially believed her. In fact, a rabbit did come out of her, and with a doctor backing up her claims, even the king and his royal surgeon got involved. However, the royal surgeon was a bit more skeptical. Upon closer examination, they found corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, proving that the animals hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft had to come clean. She admitted to the hoax, explaining that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the whole delivery seem as realistic as possible. As a consequence, she was promptly imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community faced ridicule for being fooled. And there you have it, a bizarre historical tale that reminds us that truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Thanks for watching the video, and if you found it informative, please like and subscribe to Time Capsule for similar content. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.